I survived the warp, if you can call this surviving. I'm writing this now in what the chronometer claims is the 17th hour of our subjective time since we emerged, though I no longer trust any measurement of anything, least of all time. My name was Navigation Officer 3rd Class Matthias Cole, assigned to the Imperial transport vessel Endless Duty, a bulk carrier hauling agricultural tithes from the outer reaches of Segmentum Obscurus. Was, past tense, because whatever I am now, whatever we all are now, we stopped being those people the moment the Gellar Field failed. They say the warp is a realm of nightmares, a dimension of pure chaos where the laws of reality bend and break like rotted wood. They say ships that lose their Gellar Fields are consumed, their crews driven mad or worse, transformed into things that make daemons look merciful by comparison. They say these things in hushed tones, in the lower decks, in crew quarters when the officers aren't listening. Ghost stories to pass the endless weeks of transit. I used to dismiss such talk as superstition, the kind of nonsense that uneducated ratings spread to frighten each other. I was a trained navigator's assistant, versed in the sacred geometries, educated in the proper observances. I knew the warp was dangerous, yes, but I believed in our protections. I believed in the machine spirits, in the Emperor's light, in the 3-meter-thick adamantium hull, and the blessed field generators that kept the Immaterium at bay. I was a fool. It started during our transit from Bacalar Prime to the orbital docks above Gothram 7, a standard route we'd run 24 times before. 6 weeks in the warp, maybe 7 if the currents were unfavorable, ferrying grain and protein paste to feed some hive world's endless appetite. Routine. Tedious. Safe. Or as safe as anything involving warp travel could be. I remember standing my watch in the navigation chamber, monitoring the instruments, while Navigator Cheth Horarian sat in her throne, her third eye scanning the Immaterium's currents for safe passage. The chamber always smelled of incense and ozone, the air thick with the holy oils they used to anoint the equipment. 6 other officers were present, cycling through our duties with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had worked together for 3 years. The first indication something was wrong came as a smell. Not the usual incense, but something else underneath it, something organic and wrong. Like flowers left too long in a sealed room, that sickly sweet rot that coats the back of your throat. I thought perhaps one of the ventilation scrubbers was malfunctioning, mixing waste reclamation fumes into our air supply. A minor malfunction, nothing to be concerned about. I made a note on my data slate to report it to the ship's engineers after my watch ended. Then the lights flickered. Just once, a momentary dimming that lasted perhaps a heartbeat. But in that instant of semi-darkness, I could have sworn the walls of the chamber looked different. Not the familiar corrugated metal panels, but something that writhed, something with texture like skin, like the interior of something living. When the lights returned to their normal sickly yellow glow, everything appeared as it should. I glanced at my fellow officers, saw a few furrowed brows, a few exchanged looks. But no one said anything. You don't speak of such things aloud. You don't give voice to the possibility that something might be wrong with the Gellar Field, because to acknowledge it is to invite panic, and panic is a virus that spreads faster than any plague. Navigator Horarian stirred in her throne, her augmetic hands gripping the armrests with enough force that I heard the metal creak. Her head swiveled toward us, that grotesque swaddling of blessed cloth around her mutation, shifting as if something beneath it was trying to get out. I sense turbulence ahead, she said, her voice artificial and crackling through the Vox unit implanted in her throat. Prepare for course correction. 37 degrees to port, descending through the upper currents. We moved to comply, each of us inputting the necessary calculations, adjusting the ship's vector through that impossible space that existed between real and unreal. The ship groaned around us. Not the normal protest of metal under stress, but something that sounded almost like pain, almost like a voice. I told myself it was my imagination. Ships always made noise in the warp. The hull expanded and contracted with the pressure differentials, metal screaming against metal. Normal. Routine. The smell grew stronger. Now it was accompanied by warmth, a humid heat that made my uniform stick to my skin. The temperature in the navigation chamber was supposed to be kept at precisely 15 degrees Celsius, maintained by the ship's climate controls with near-religious precision. I could see condensation beginning to form on some of the instrument panels, droplets running down displays like tears. One of the junior officers, a young woman named Kellick, wiped at her forehead, her hand coming away slick with sweat. She looked at her palm with an expression of confusion, then disgust, as if she'd touched something unclean. "Navigator," I ventured, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "I'm reading fluctuations in the Gellar Field integrity. Segments 7 through 12 showing intermittent instability." There was a pause, longer than there should have been. When Horarian spoke again, her voice carried an edge I'd never heard before, something between fear and resignation. "Confirmed. The field is struggling. Something is pressing against it. Something large. Something large." In the warp, scale meant nothing and everything. A daemon the size of a city could be crushed by a thought the size of a grain of sand. But when a navigator, someone who could perceive the Immaterium directly, says something is large, you listen. I felt my pulse quicken, heard it thundering in my ears like the rhythm of the ship's plasma drives. "Attempting to alter course," Horarian continued. "We need to avoid whatever this is." The ship lurched, a violent sideways motion that sent 2 officers stumbling into their consoles. The gravity plating stuttered for an instant, making my stomach rise into my throat before slamming me back down with twice the usual force. Alarms began to sound, first the minor alerts, then progressively more urgent klaxons. Red emergency lighting flickered to life, bathing the navigation chamber in a bloody glow. I grabbed the edge of my station to steady myself, felt the metal strangely warm under my fingers, almost like touching skin. "Gellar Field at 78%, someone shouted. Probably Tertius. He was assigned to monitor defensive systems. 73%. "It's degrading." Navigator Horarian's body went rigid, her back arching against the throne's restraints. A sound came from behind her wrappings, something between a scream and a laugh, high and terrible. Her augmetic fingers spasmed, input cables tearing free from their sockets, sparking and writhing like severed serpents. "I see it," she gasped. "Emperor preserve us. I see what's out there. It's looking back." The temperature spiked. It must have been 40 degrees now, maybe more. The air felt thick, soupy, hard to breathe. That smell of rotting flowers intensified until it seemed to fill my skull, until I could taste it, coating my tongue like rancid oil. I wanted to vomit, but forced the bile down. Around me, other officers weren't so successful. I heard retching, saw Kellick double over, strings of yellowish fluid pouring from her mouth onto the deck. "Field at 60%, Tertius shouted, his voice cracking. "We need to emergency translate back to real space, now." "Negative," Captain Vorhang's voice crackled over the vox, transmitted from the bridge. "We're in the middle of a warp current. Emergency translation could tear us apart. Navigator, find us a path out of this." But Horarian was screaming now, a continuous sound that shouldn't have been able to come from a human throat. Her body thrashed against the restraints, and I saw blood beginning to seep through the blessed wrappings around her head. Not the normal red of human blood, but something darker, something with an iridescent quality, like oil catching light. The throne's built-in life support system tried to compensate, pumping sedatives into her system, but she fought against it with inhuman strength. "Field at 45%, Tertius said, and now his voice was barely a whisper. "Emperor, protect us. Emperor, protect." The lights went out. Complete and absolute darkness, the kind that presses against your eyeballs like physical weight. Then, slowly, a different kind of light began to seep in. Not from the emergency lumens, not from any mechanical source. This light came through the walls themselves, a sickly purple-green glow that outlined every rivet, every panel, every seam in the chamber's construction. In that hideous illumination, I could see the metal beginning to change. It wasn't corrosion, wasn't any kind of physical deterioration I could name. The walls were becoming translucent, as if the material reality of the ship was being worn away like old fabric. And through those translucent walls, I could see the warp. No human should see the warp unshielded. Our minds aren't built for it, aren't equipped to process that kind of unreality. It's like trying to comprehend a color that doesn't exist, a sound at frequencies your ears can't register but your bones can feel. I saw shapes that hurt to perceive, geometries that folded in on themselves in ways that made my vision blur and double. I saw things moving out there in that impossible space, vast and terrible, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter and meaning. One instant, they looked like ships, great vessels of bone and screaming faces. The next, they were storms of teeth and eyes and reaching hands, stretching across distances that my mind translated as kilometers, but might have been light years or mere centimeters. And they were swimming toward us. Field at 30%, someone whispered. Might have been Tertius, might have been me. I wasn't sure anymore. Time felt strange, stretched and compressed simultaneously. Each second lasted hours, but hours passed in heartbeats. The first breach happened in Section 12, deep in the aft quarters where the lower deck crew berthed. I only knew about it because the screaming came through the Vox system, hundreds of voices all shrieking at once in perfect harmony before cutting off into wet silence. Then Section 11 went, then 10. The warp wasn't just leaking in, it was flooding through the ship like water through a broken hull, sweeping through decks and corridors and chambers, consuming everyone in its path. Navigator Horarian's screaming stopped. In the warp light's glow, I watched as she lifted her head, as her augmetic hands moved with sudden, precise grace to unwrap the blessed cloth around her face. I wanted to look away. You're not supposed to see a navigator's third eye, not unless you want to risk madness. But I couldn't move. None of us could. We stood frozen, transfixed, as she revealed what was beneath. It wasn't her face anymore. Oh, the features were still technically there, the nose and mouth and those 3 eyes arranged in their unnatural configuration. But something else was there too, something looking out from behind those eyes, something that wore her face the way you or I might wear a mask. When it smiled, the expression was wrong, the angles all slightly off, like a child's drawing of happiness rendered in flesh. "The field is gone," the thing wearing Horarian said, but her voice had changed. Now it was multiple voices speaking in unison, a chorus of sounds ranging from the deepest bass to the highest soprano, all perfectly synchronized. We are in the warp. The warp is in us. There is no difference anymore. I felt it then, the moment the Gellar Field failed completely. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't accompanied by any great crash or explosion. It was more like a bubble popping. That moment when surface tension fails, and suddenly there's nothing keeping the inside separate from the outside. Reality and unreality merged, and we were caught at the intersection. The air itself became visible, thick and luminous like fog, but somehow alive. I could see it moving, swirling in patterns that suggested intentionality, purpose. It flowed into my mouth when I gasped, cold and electric, tasting of copper and ozone, and something else, something sweet that made me think of meat left in the sun. Around me, my fellow officers were experiencing the same thing. I watched Kellick's eyes roll back in her head, watched her mouth open wider than should have been anatomically possible, watched something that looked like smoke but moved like worms pour out from between her lips. My skin began to itch. Not a surface irritation, but something deeper, something that felt like movement under my flesh. I looked down at my hands, saw the skin rippling as if something was crawling beneath it. The sensation was maddening, overwhelming, and I clawed at my uniform trying to get to the source of the itch. My fingernails tore fabric, then skin, and I watched in horrid fascination as I opened myself up and saw what was moving inside me. They looked like insects, but insects made of light and thought rather than chitin. Thousands of them, millions maybe, living in the spaces between my cells, feeding on whatever makes a person a person. I could feel them eating my memories, consuming the neural pathways that held my identity. Faces I'd known, places I'd been, moments that defined who Matthias Cole was, all of it being devoured, digested, transformed into something else. But the worst part was that it didn't hurt. It should have hurt, should have been agony, but instead it felt almost pleasant. Each memory consumed left behind a strange euphoria, a lightness, as if I was being freed from the burden of being myself. I wanted to resist it, wanted to hold on to who I was, but the temptation to let go was overwhelming. Why struggle? Why fight? It would be so much easier to just surrender, to let these things eat away everything that made me human and replace it with something new, something better. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that moment of transformation. Time had ceased to function properly. I was simultaneously watching myself be unmade and also experiencing thousands of other perspectives, other lives, other deaths. I was the ship, feeling the Immaterium seep into my metal bones. I was the captain on the bridge, watching his crew dissolve into geometric patterns of screaming color. I was the engine seer in the depths of the ship, feeling the machine spirits he'd tended for decades suddenly wake into terrible sentience and begin asking questions about the nature of pain. I was everyone and no one, everywhere and nowhere. When I finally regained something approximating individual consciousness, I was no longer in the navigation chamber. I was in a corridor, though I couldn't say which corridor or on which deck. The walls here had completely given way to the warp's intrusion, the metal replaced by something that looked like stone but bled when you touched it. The floor beneath my feet felt soft, spongy, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat I'd ever heard. The lighting came from floating spheres that might have been globes of plasma, or might have been screaming faces compressed into perfect spheres. My eyes couldn't decide which interpretation was correct and kept switching between them. I wasn't alone. There were others in the corridor, though I hesitate to call them crew anymore. They'd been crew once. I recognized their uniforms, but the things wearing those uniforms had changed. One of them had too many limbs, arms sprouting from impossible places, each hand holding a different object. A wrench, a prayer book, a human heart still beating, a chunk of hull plating, things I couldn't identify. Another's head had been replaced with a door, a hatch that kept opening and closing, and each time it opened I could see different scenes playing out inside. A childhood memory, a murder, a birth, a execution. All happening simultaneously. They ignored me, these transformed things, going about their business with the same dedication they'd shown in their previous lives. The one with too many arms was doing maintenance, tightening bolts that screamed when the wrench touched them, reading passages from the prayer book to equipment that had grown teeth. The one with the door head was walking patrol routes, checking each door it passed, and whenever it opened its own head door, whatever was in the room beyond would change to match the scene inside. I tried to speak, to call out to them, to ask what was happening. But when I opened my mouth, what came out wasn't words. It was a sound like wind through broken glass, a melody that tasted of numbers and smelled of regret. The other things in the corridor stopped and turned toward me, and I realized they were trying to communicate that the sounds and smells and impossible sensations they were producing were language, just not any language based in conventional reality. And somehow, impossibly, I understood them. The ship is changing, they said without saying. We are changing with it. This is our new duty. This is our new purpose. We serve the ship. The ship serves the great powers. The great powers serve nothing but their own hunger. I ran then, or tried to. Movement in this space didn't work the way it should. Each step I took carried me either too far or not far enough, and sometimes I'd put my foot down and find myself somewhere else entirely, as if the act of walking had folded space around me. I passed through chambers I recognized and chambers I'd never seen before, chambers that couldn't possibly exist within the ship's original architecture. One room was filled with water that burned, another with a garden growing flowers made of fingers, another that was simply a void, an absence so complete that looking into it made my eyes ache. I found myself eventually at what I thought was the bridge. The door was where the bridge door should be, but when I passed through it, I entered something that was both the bridge and not the bridge. The command throne was there, and something that might have been Captain Vorhang was sitting in it, but he'd merged with the chair, his flesh flowing into the metal and his metal augmetics growing into the flesh until it was impossible to say where the man ended and the furniture began. His eyes, he had dozens of them now, growing like tumors across his face and neck and chest, all turned to regard me as I entered. "Officer Cole," he said, and his voice was almost normal, almost the stern professional tone I remembered. "You're late for your watch." "Sir," I tried to say, but again, only that glass wind number sound came out. He seemed to understand anyway. "The ship is holding together," he continued. "Mostly. We're still translating through the warp, still heading toward our destination. We'll reach Gotham 7th on schedule. The cargo is secure. The machine spirits are content. Everything is proceeding nominally." It was insane. He was insane. We were all insane. The ship had been consumed by the warp. The crew transformed into things that barely qualified as living. Reality itself had bent and broken around us, and he was acting like this was a normal transit, a routine voyage. But then I realized he was right. The ship was still moving, still functioning. The engines were running. The navigation system still calculated our course. The cargo holds still maintained their environmental seals. The ship's essential functions continued because the things we'd become still performed their duties. We'd been transformed, yes, but we hadn't been destroyed. We were still the crew of the times, endless duty asterisk, still carrying out our assigned tasks, just in forms and ways that bore no resemblance to what we'd been before. I felt something shift inside me then, a final surrendering of resistance. Why fight it? Why struggle to maintain a humanity that was already gone? The warp had taken everything I was and replaced it with something new, but that new thing still had purpose, still had function. I was still Navigation Officer 3rd Class Matthias Cole, in whatever sense those words had meaning anymore. I still had duties to perform. The captain's many eyes blinked in sequence, creating a wave motion across his face. "Return to your station, officer. We have 6 weeks left in transit. Subjective time. Perhaps more if the currents shift. I need you at your post." I went. I navigated through the transformed corridors, past crew members who were and weren't crew members anymore, through spaces that existed in defiance of conventional geometry, until I found the navigation chamber. It was different now. The instruments replaced with things that served the same function but looked nothing like conventional equipment. Where there had been screens showing star charts, now there were pools of liquid that showed reflections of places that didn't exist. Where there had been input consoles, now there were things like keyboards, but made of what looked like frozen music, each key producing a sensation rather than a symbol when pressed. Navigator Horarian was still in her throne, or what remained of her was. She'd become something immense, her body grown to fill most of the chamber, her flesh merged with the walls and ceiling and floor. Her 3 eyes had multiplied, becoming a field of seeing organs that covered every surface, each one looking in a different direction, perceiving different aspects of the warp's infinite complexity. When I entered, all of those eyes focused on me simultaneously, and I felt her consciousness touch mine, vast and alien and still, somehow, recognizable as the person she'd been. "We navigate," she said, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "We chart our course through impossible waters. We guide the ship between predators and maelstroms. We do our duty, as we always have. Nothing has changed except the nature of what we are." She was right. We were still doing our jobs, still serving the Imperium in our way, still ensuring the cargo reached its destination. The fact that we'd become something monstrous in the process was irrelevant. The Imperium needed its grain. The hive-worlders needed to eat. The tithes had to be paid. These things mattered more than individual humanity, more than the sanctity of flesh and sanity. I took my station, or the thing that served as my station now. My hands, which I noticed had developed an extra joint in each finger, moved across the impossible instruments with practiced efficiency. Data flowed into me, not through my eyes but directly into whatever passed for my brain now. A stream of information about warp currents and real space coordinates, and the ship's position relative to both. I processed it, calculated course corrections, transmitted instructions to the engine room where things that had been engine seers now tended, plasma drives that had become partially sentient and learned to scream. Time passed. Days or weeks or years, I couldn't say. The chronometers still ran, still marked off seconds and minutes and hours, but those measurements felt arbitrary, disconnected from any real sense of duration. Sometimes I would look up from my station and realize I'd been working for hours without pause. Other times, what felt like seconds would prove to be days. The warp cared nothing for temporal consistency. The other things in the navigation chamber worked alongside me, each performing their assigned tasks with the same dedication they'd shown before the Gellar Field failed. We didn't speak much. Conventional speech had become difficult for most of us, but we communicated through other means. Shared sensations, exchanged thoughts, ideas, passed between minds that no longer had clear boundaries. We functioned as a unit, a collective consciousness dedicated to a single purpose, keeping the ship on course. Occasionally, things would happen. Attacks from warp entities who saw our transformed ship as either prey or rival. Incursions of smaller daemons who tried to nest in the cargo holds or take over vital systems. We repelled them, not because we hated them or feared them, but because they interfered with our duty. The ship's defensive weapons still worked, though they no longer fired conventional ordnance. Now they launched pieces of reality, fragments of what the ship used to be, and when those fragments struck the daemon things, they annihilated each other in bursts of conceptual contradiction. I watched crew members die during these attacks, saw them torn apart or consumed or transformed into things even more alien than we'd already become. Each time it happened, I felt something that might have been grief, a distant echo of the emotion I'd once been capable of. But it was muted, filtered through layers of transformation until it was barely recognizable. When Officer Kellick was pulled into a breach and disappeared into the raw warp, I noted her loss in the duty roster and assigned her responsibilities to another crew member without ceremony. That was the appropriate response. That was what the Imperium required. The ship developed. The salve of the memories. Characteristics. Personality traits. Almost. The corridor walls would sometimes display scenes from the crew's memories, mixing them together into impossible narratives. The ship's Vox system would occasionally speak in voices that belonged to no one and everyone, offering advice or making observations about our progress. The machine spirits, those fragments of holy code that governed the ship's systems, had woken into something larger, something that might have qualified as genuine intelligence if intelligence could exist without being attached to anything you'd call alive. "We are one," the ship would say through a dozen speakers simultaneously. "Crew and vessel, flesh and metal, purpose and form, we serve the Emperor in this new shape. We carry his tithes through the warp. We are blessed." Were we blessed? I couldn't say anymore. The concepts of blessing and curse had lost meaning. We simply were, and what we were served a function. That seemed sufficient. Navigator Horarian would sometimes share what she perceived in the warp, the vast, incomprehensible vistas that spread out in all directions. She saw great structures made of crystallized time, cities built from the bones of dead stars, oceans of liquid thought, forests of screaming light. She saw other ships like ours, vessels that had lost their Gellar Fields and been transformed, now sailing the warp permanently, their crews becoming eternal navigators through impossible space. Some had been lost for centuries, maybe longer, time having no real meaning in this realm. They'd forgotten their original destinations, forgotten why they'd entered the warp at all. But they still moved, still navigated, still carried out whatever purpose their transformed natures demanded. "We won't be like them," Horarian would say, her multitude of voices speaking in harmony. "We know our destination. We remember our duty. We will emerge when the time is right." And she was right. Despite everything, despite the absolute violation of reality that had occurred, we remained on course. The navigation systems, transformed as they were, still tracked our progress through the warp. We were still heading toward Gothram 7, still carrying our cargo of grain and protein paste, still fulfilling our tithe obligation to the Imperium. The question that haunted me, in the rare moments when my transformed mind was capable of contemplation, was what would happen when we arrived. What would the orbital authorities think when they saw the Time's endless duty times requesting docking clearance? Would they see what we'd become? Would they understand that we were still Imperial servants, still faithful to the Emperor despite our monstrous forms? Or would they see only corruption, only chaos taint and destroy us without hesitation. I thought about the cargo holds, sealed and preserved, the grain still edible despite spending weeks in a ship that had become partially daemonic. I thought about how hungry the hive-worlders would be, how desperately they needed those tithes. Would the authorities reject perfectly good food because of where it had been, what it had survived? The Imperium was many things, but wasteful was rarely one of them. Perhaps they would accept the cargo, even if they destroyed the ship and crew that delivered it. The thought of my own death, when I could still think about it clearly, produced no fear. I'd already died, in every way that mattered. The person called Matthias Cole had been consumed by the warp, his memories and personality and humanity devoured by those things made of light and thought. What wore his body now was something else, something that served the same function but could barely be called the same person. If that thing were to be destroyed, would it count as a death? Or would it be more like dismantling a machine, breaking down a tool that had outlived its usefulness? Captain Vorhang called us to a meeting once, summoning all the senior officers to the bridge. We gathered there, or the things we'd become gathered, each of us changed in different ways but all still recognizable by our uniforms and our ranks. The captain, still merged with his throne, regarded us with his many eyes. "We're approaching the system," he said. 3 more days, subjective time. When we translate back to real space, we'll be within Gothram the Seven's orbital space. I want all stations prepared for emergence. I want the ship presentable. Presentable. The word was almost funny, in a sick way. How do you make a ship that's been partially consumed by the warp presentable? How do you hide the fact that your crew has been transformed into things that make daemons look natural? But we tried. We cleaned the corridors as best we could, removing the most obvious signs of corruption. We covered the walls where they'd become too translucent, too obviously not metal anymore. We adjusted the lighting to hide the worst of the changes. The crew members who'd transformed most drastically were assigned to internal duties, kept away from areas where docking officials might see them. Those of us who still looked relatively human, and I was surprised to discover I qualified, my transformations being mostly internal, were put on display duty, ready to interact with whoever came aboard. We did all this not out of shame or fear, but because it served our purpose. If we could deliver the cargo without incident, that would be optimal. If our transformed nature prevented delivery, that would be failure. Failure was unacceptable. Therefore, we would do whatever necessary to appear normal enough to complete our mission. The day of emergence came. I was at my station, my extra-jointed fingers moving across instruments that looked almost conventional if you squinted. Navigator Horarian began the process of translation, pulling the ship back toward real space through calculations that involved mathematics that shouldn't exist. The ship groaned and shuddered, reality and unreality grinding against each other like tectonic plates. For a moment, I felt something like hope. Perhaps when we emerged, perhaps when we left the warp behind, we would return to normal. Perhaps the transformation would reverse. The flesh would heal. The metal would become metal again. Perhaps Matthias Cole would wake up as if from a nightmare, restored and whole. But I knew better. The warp had marked us, changed us on a fundamental level. You don't survive the warp unshielded. You don't exist in that space of pure chaos and come out unchanged. We would emerge as we were now, and we would remain that way until death or worse found us. The translation was rough, violent, like being born through a too small opening. I felt the ship lurch back into real space, felt conventional physics reassert themselves with brutal force. Systems that had adapted to warp logic suddenly had to contend with normal causality again. Several of them failed immediately, burning out or simply ceasing to function. Emergency alarms screamed throughout the ship. But we'd made it. We'd translated successfully. The viewports, which had shown only the warp's impossible vistas for weeks, now showed normal space. Stars, planets. The beautiful, mundane reality of conventional existence. In the distance, I could make out Gothram 7th, a massive gas giant with orbital stations clustered around it like steel jewels. Navigation, plot approach vector. The captain ordered, his voice almost normal, almost human. Communications, Hail the orbital authority. Request docking clearance for cargo transfer. We moved to comply. I input the course corrections, feeling my transformed fingers work with practiced efficiency. The communications officer, a woman named Tertia, who'd developed the ability to speak in multiple frequencies simultaneously, transmitted our identification codes and docking request. The response came back quickly. Too quickly. Unidentified vessel. This is Gothram the 7th Orbital Control. Your transponder codes are corrupted. Please transmit verification manually. Be advised, we're reading strange emissions from your vessel. You are ordered to hold position while we investigate. Corrupted codes. Strange emissions. They knew something was wrong. Of course they did. You can't hide what we'd become. Not really. The warp leaves marks that can be detected, signatures that no amount of cleaning can remove. Prepare to be boarded, the orbital control continued. A security team is en route. Any attempt to flee or resist will be met with extreme prejudice. 1. Captain Vorhang's many eyes blinked in sequence. Stand down from stations, he said quietly. Let them board. Let them see. We have nothing to hide. We've done our duty. We've delivered the Emperor's tithes. We waited. The security team arrived in a gunship, heavily armed arbitrators in power armor, accompanied by a tech priest, and what I recognized as an inquisitorial acolyte. They cycled through the airlock cautiously, weapons raised, scanning everything with auger arrays and purity detectors. I could see the moment they realized what they were looking at. The arbitrator in the lead stopped, his weapon wavering, his helmet's external speakers broadcasting a choked sound that might have been a prayer or might have been vomit. The tech priest's mechadendrites flared in a defensive posture, and I heard it start broadcasting binary cant, rapid-fire prayers to the machine god. The inquisitorial acolyte, to his credit, remained composed. He stepped forward, his own weapon still holstered, and regarded us with eyes that had seen horrors before. What happened here? He asked, his voice level. Captain Vorhang, or the thing he'd become, tried to stand from his throne. The flesh-metal hybrid groaned and stretched but couldn't separate. He settled for turning his many eyes toward the acolyte. Gellar Field failure, he said. 6 weeks ago, subjective time. We survived. We adapted. We completed our mission. The cargo is intact. 20 million tons of grain, ready for transfer. The acolyte studied us for a long moment. I could see him evaluating, calculating, weighing options. You should have been destroyed, he said finally. What you are now. This is corruption. This is chaos taint. By law, I should order your immediate execution and the purging of this vessel. By law, the captain agreed. But the grain is clean. We checked. It survived in the sealed holds, untouched by what happened to us. 20 million tons of food for the hive worlds. How many lives will starve if you destroy it? The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see the conflict on the acolyte's face, the war between dogma and practicality. The Imperium demands purity, abhors corruption, sees chaos taint as the ultimate evil. But the Imperium also runs on pragmatism, on cold calculation, on the willingness to accept lesser evils to prevent greater ones. The cargo will be transferred, the acolyte said finally, under heavy guard and extensive testing. If even a single grain shows signs of taint, all of it burns. He turned to the arbitrators. Begin documentation. I want every crew member's identity recorded, their symptoms detailed, their rate of mutation tracked. This ship is now a quarantine site. We cooperated. What choice did we have? They herded us into sections of the ship, separated us, examined us with instruments and prayers and psychic probes. They took samples of our flesh, scans of our thoughts, recordings of our testimonies. They treated us like specimens, like things to be studied rather than people to be saved. The cargo transfer took 3 days. We watched through the viewports as massive container ships docked with the Time's endless duty asterisk, as mechanical arms and servitor loaders moved the grain from our holds to theirs. The grain was clean, just as the captain had said. Every test came back negative for taint, for mutation, for daemonic influence. The food was wholesome and pure, untouched by the warp despite spending weeks in a ship that had been consumed by it. When the transfer was complete, the acolyte returned to the bridge. He looked tired, older than he had before. "Your service is noted," he told the captain. "The Imperium acknowledges your completion of duty under extreme circumstances. The cargo has been successfully delivered." "And us?" the captain asked, though I think we all knew the answer. "You can't be allowed to live," the acolyte said. "Not unkindly, just stating fact. What you've become, it's too dangerous. If even one of you were to leave this ship, the contamination could spread. We've already detected minor warp anomalies in the sections you occupied. Given time, given freedom, you could transform an entire world into what you are now." I felt nothing at his words. No fear, no anger, no despair, just acceptance. He was right, of course. We were dangerous, unstable, corrupted beyond redemption. Death was the appropriate outcome. "We understand," the captain said. "We request only one thing. Let it be quick. We've served the Imperium faithfully. We delivered our cargo. We deserve at least a clean death." The acolyte nodded. "You do. And you'll have it. The ship will be towed into Gothram the Seven's gravity well and released. You'll be given time to make your peace, to say your prayers. When you're ready, signal us. We'll cut you loose." Second, they left us then, the security team returning to their gunship, the acolyte taking his data slates and samples and recordings back to whatever inquisitorial facility would study them. The Times' endless duty times was taken under tow, massive tugs latching onto our hull and pulling us toward the gas giant. Through the viewports, I could see Gothram the Seventh growing larger, its storms swirling in hypnotic patterns, its gravity well deep enough to crush even a ship as large as ours. We gathered on the bridge, all of us, the transformed crew assembling one final time. Some could no longer fit through the doors and had to manifest as projections or psychic presences. Navigator Horarion, too large now to move from her chamber, participated through the ship's Vox system, her many voices filling the space. "We did our duty," the captain said. His many eyes looked at each of us in turn. Whatever we became, however we changed, we remained faithful. We delivered the Emperor's tithes. We served the Imperium. No one can take that from us. "No one can take that from us," we echoed, our transformed voices creating a harmony that was almost beautiful. The tugs released us. The Times' endless duty times began its final journey, falling into Gothram the Seven's embrace. Through the viewports, I watched the gas giant fill my vision, watched the storms grow from distant weather patterns to immediate, violent reality. The ship's hull groaned, metal protesting as gravitational forces began to tear us apart. I thought about the person I'd been, Matthias Cole, navigation officer 3rd class. I thought about my life before the warp, the mundane concerns and small fears and simple pleasures. I thought about my family, somewhere in the Imperium, who would receive word that I'd died in service. They'd never know what really happened, never understand what I'd become. Perhaps that was a mercy. The ship began to break apart, sections tearing away and tumbling into the gas giant's depths. I felt the navigation chamber decompress, felt the atmosphere rush out into space. My transformed body didn't need air the way a human body did, so I survived, watching as crew members around me were pulled into the void. Some screamed, some were silent, some laughed with voices that had too many harmonics. Navigator Horarion's presence touched my mind one last time. "We navigate even this," she said. "One final transit. One final journey." "One final journey," I agreed. The heat came next, Gothram 7's upper atmosphere igniting what remained of the ship. Metal melted, flesh burned, the boundaries between both dissolving in temperatures that approached stellar levels. I felt myself being unmade, not by the warp this time, but by simple physics, by natural forces doing what natural forces do. In my final moments, as the fire consumed me, I felt something unexpected. Not peace, exactly, but satisfaction. We'd done what we were supposed to do. Against all odds, despite a fate that should have ended in madness and corruption, we'd delivered our cargo. The grain would feed the hive worlds. The Imperium would continue. Our deaths served a purpose. The warp had tried to break us, tried to transform us into monsters that would spread chaos wherever we went. And it had succeeded in changing us, yes, but it had failed to break our purpose. We remained, in whatever form, servants of the Imperium. We remained faithful. As the fire reached my core, as my consciousness began to fragment and dissolve, I thought I heard the Emperor's voice. Perhaps it was just neurons misfiring, the last spasms of a dying brain. Perhaps it was actual divine contact, the God Emperor acknowledging our sacrifice. I don't know. It doesn't matter. What matters is what the voice said. "Well done, my servant. Well done." The times, endless duty times, burned in Gotham 7's atmosphere for 3 days before finally breaking apart completely. The Inquisition monitored the process, ensuring no piece large enough to contain viable corruption survived. When it was done, when nothing remained but scattered atoms mixing with the gas giant's storms, they updated their records. The ship was listed as destroyed, the crew was listed as dead, the cargo was listed as delivered, the tithe was marked as paid. Everything was in order, everything properly documented. The Imperium's vast bureaucracy noted the incident, filed it appropriately, and moved on to the next crisis. Somewhere in the depths of the warp, something that had once been a ship called the Time's endless duty times still existed, an echo or reflection or ghost. And on that ghost ship, things that had once been human still performed their duties, still navigated impossible waters, still served in their corrupted way. They would sail those warp tides forever, trapped between death and existence, carrying cargo that would never be delivered to destinations they would never reach. But that's not the real Time's endless duty asterisk. The real ship died in fire and gravity, and its real crew died with it. We completed our mission, we fulfilled our purpose, we did our duty. In the end, what more can any servant of the Imperium ask for?